The development of next-generation robotics technologies has been cited as an important part of the EU's future economic growth and recovery. But there are also perilous pitfalls at play, should the bloc overlook various policy challenges in terms of high-risk robotics, data protection, and consumer rights. This week we delve into the future of EU robotics to give you an exclusive insight into what's in store. Welcome to Euractiv's Digital Brief podcast. My name is Samuel Stolten, and each week I aim to bring you some of the most relevant and timely technology stories in the world of EU politics and policy. For a full breakdown of all the most important stories over the past 7 days in this patch, sign up to my free newsletter or take a look at it online at euractiv.com. This is Euractiv's Digital Brief podcast.
This episode is powered by Facebook. Working together is more important than ever in the fight against COVID-19. At Facebook, we're working with nearly 100 governments and organisations globally, including the World Health Organization and European Centre for Disease Control, to distribute authoritative COVID-19 information on our platforms. Get the full story at about.fb.com/Europe.
The European Commission has pitched robotics technologies as, and I quote, offering new solutions to societal challenges from ageing to health, smart transport, security, energy and environment, and adds that such tools could help to construct a competitive manufacturing sector where millions of jobs are at stake. In terms of global competitiveness, the European Commission believes that robotics could be of particular benefit to the bloc's small and medium-sized enterprises. In this vein, the EU executive has recently been keen to promote the development of robotics as part of so-called digital innovation hubs, supported by funding from the EU's Digital Europe programme. Speaking recently, Director General of the Commission's DG Connect, Roberto Viola, had this to say.
A brand new program which is called Digital Europe, which is applying robotics for real. And they are coming to the small and medium enterprises. There's a specific action that we are promoting, which is the concept of digital innovation hubs. The concept of digital innovation hubs is that small and larger enterprises and universities can come together and actually experiment or work on co-work on robotic solutions. For instance, if you take an automated printer, 3D printer for industrial production purposes, this is a very costly machine. And so a very specialized machine to operate. It's very useful for an SME, even a traditional SME that maybe works in the furniture sector or shoe sector. This machine would be necessary. So in the digital innovation hub, small SMEs can work together with advanced manufacturing tools and get all the necessary skills and support.
But of course, it's not just about money. Can the EU build a policy framework that is able to foster the development of robotics? In this context, there are several files which the Commission is paying attention to. In terms of robot safety and the societal issues raised by artificial intelligence in robots, this will get a look in as part of the Commission's upcoming revision of the Machinery Directive later this year. Secondly, the Radio Equipment Directive could be looked at, in order to better protect communications transmissions from fraudulent activity. And thirdly, the Commission is looking at adapting the Product Liability Directive in terms of readjusting to the new challenges presented by next-generation robotics. Here's the Commission's Gwenole Kozigu, Director for Sustainable Industry and Mobility at DG GROW, speaking on this subject.
On the legislation itself, the adequate regulatory framework that we need, that would actually need to both address the challenges, but also make sure that the opportunities are not missed. I'll mention some examples there, perhaps, that fall more directly into the remit of DG GROW in terms of legislative initiatives that are under preparation. We have very important regulatory piece, which is the machinery directive that is being presently revised. And the Commission will propose a revision very soon in a few months to come, of which one objective will be to address various elements that are linked to robots. That will be one of the objectives, of course. First, the question of robot safety, in particular the human-machine interaction or collaboration. Second, the question of software, which are seen as a safety component, but for which human oversight should be guaranteed, because that's also a challenge we've got. And we want also to address the issues raised by algorithms in AI robots, so that there is some transparency for them as well vis-à-vis the regulator. The second piece of legislation, which is the framework for the moment of activities we have in terms of delegated acts, is the radio equipment directive, which is basically the directive that regulates everything that emits or receives, and therefore there's a particular relevance when robots communicate, and it's directly linked with the Internet of Things. There we work on with three different preoccupations. The first one is protection and privacy and personal data. And because we've got certain cases where we've seen a need, in particular for children to be protected, but not only for children. Protection from fraud, so basically to protect from fraudulent actions from outside. And the third direction we want to pursue on this one is compliance regarding the combination of radio equipment and software. And I finish, we're also looking at another piece of legislation, because with these pieces of legislation, we think that everything will go well, but accidents can still occur. So when things don't go well, then we've got a product liability directive that we're also looking at in terms of adapting it to the new possible challenges that would be presented by the characteristics of emerging technologies, in particular artificial intelligence.
And then indeed, of course, we have the risks that inevitably come with the onset of new technologies such as robotics. For this cause, earlier this week I caught up with Paul Nemitz, Principal Advisor in the Commission's Directorate General for Justice and Consumers. We spoke about the challenges that will arise in terms of consumer protection, fundamental rights, and the very bizarre psychosocial phenomenon of mistaking a robot for a human. I think it's a good time to perhaps jump into a question about the current context and Europe's development of robotics amid this very strange reality that we're living under at the moment. Of course, living in this situation whereby we're having to keep in touch with loved ones remotely, we're having to work remotely. What sort of an impact has this had on the Commission's attempts to foster Europe's robotics industries? And in what ways could robotics become more of a key technology under the present circumstances and beyond?
Well, let me say, first of all, professionally, of course, I work in DG Justice on fundamental rights and democracy issues related to technologies. But being a political person, I think it is fair to say that Europe has already a great set of achievements in robotics. Traditionally, workplaces in some member states have been very highly capitalized by automation and by robotics. And this has actually been an important competitive advantage in the sense that robotics helps to make work stay in Europe and not go to low-wage countries, because robots are both more precise and can also make the cost of production lower. So in that sense, the industrial policy of the Commission has always been in favor of competitiveness, and robots always have played a role. And now, in combination with AI, this is, of course, becoming even more interesting. And I think the challenge of the day is to marry the great advantage of traditional robots, which Europe has in industry robotics in particular, with the new technologies of automation, AI, and the digital, and to do this in a way which respects the human individual. For example, in the partnership between the robot who gets to know his or her colleague the human who works with him or her, the robot, and in the way the robot collects knowledge and data about the individual. In these contexts, I think we should also be the leader of human dignity and protection of individual rights, such as data protection, thus always making it clear that the human is not an object of the robot and under control of the robot, but that it is the human which controls the machine, also in the age of AI, and not the other way around.
Now, of course, Paul, you work in the Commission's DG for Justice and Consumers. How important is the question of fundamental rights, consumer rights, and even ethics in the development of robotics in Europe? And to how much of an extent is this a consideration at the forefront of the Commission's thinking?
Well, I would say in the context of AI, this is important because AI can go far beyond robotics in the sense that AI can also control systems, let's say, of societal communication, in the run-up to elections, and opinion building in terms of AI controlling the algorithms which serve as the news which we read on the social networks or the videos which we see on video platforms. And I think traditional robotics, in particular industrial robotics, is there less of a concern. There are some specific areas of consumer protection. We have to be attentive that robotics respects the rules. For example, when it comes to toys, there have been some cases where robot-like toys, puppets which seem to talk and so on, collect data about children or about individuals in their surrounding and even transmit them to the company which has produced them and so on. So I would say there are some areas in the consumer protection and in data protection in particular where consumer robots have to be looked at with care. There's one area which I would like to mention also in the consumer area when it comes to human likeness of robots, where robots look like humans and have, they may look like having eyes and they may be smiling and so on. There are a number of studies on its way in Europe which study whether the human attention to problems is reduced when a machine has human likenesses. And I think there we have to be careful that the line between providing a good service in the form of a robot on the one hand and manipulation of individuals, for example, making old people fall in love with their robots and therefore becoming manipulatable, is not crossed. I think these are concerns where I think it is good if Europe leads, because nowhere in the world in the end and in the long term, people would want to have robots who manipulate human beings.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And of course, these types of concerns, Paul, are derived from a particular ethical stance. What are the principles that guides the Commission's approach when it comes to ethics and robotics?
Well, I think the first principle for the Commission is that the important questions which relate to society and technology cannot be left alone to ethics, but must be regulated by law. Why? Because this is what democracy requires. All important issues in a society should not be left just to private circles or government appointed ethics committees, but they should be decided by parliament. And the law is a very important element of our common market in the sense that it provides a level playing field and is also enforceable, including against those who don't want to play ball. And unfortunately, in this world, we do have players, big and small, who don't want to stick to the rules, and therefore we need tools of enforcement. I think that is the first principle. And then when it comes to ethics, we have had on AI in particular a high-level working group which has put down a number of principles which the Commission has also endorsed. and some of which will find their way into a legislative proposal on, let's say, setting a framework for AI, which the Commission will most likely put on the table at the end of March.
Indeed. And actually, I just wanted to pick up on that last point with regards to this forthcoming legislation on artificial intelligence that is widely regarded to be a follow-up on last year's white paper on AI that, of course, earmarked a series of high-risk applications and high-risk uses of artificial intelligence in Europe. In what way will this forthcoming legislation address some of the issues of perhaps high-risk robotic technologies in Europe?
I'm, not sure I can anticipate on the content of the legislative proposal, but I think it's probably fair to say that AI is an all-purpose technology, and you will find it both within robots, but also in the context of other functions. And the purpose of this instrument will be to set a regulatory framework for AI, not specifically for robotics.
And I suppose more generally in that vein, Paul, do we need some sort of a new regulatory environment completely for the onset of next generation robotics technologies in Europe? And what does that regulatory environment look like?
Well, I must say I'm always hesitating to jump too quickly to the conclusion that we need new law. I do believe the law is the most noble instrument of democracy. That's why we shouldn't talk it down. And let's say much of the tonality of talking about the law, in the digital economy is not a good tonality. I think we live in times where it's just not on to talk down the law, because that means talking down democracy. This being said, before making a new law, the Commission always goes through and has to go through a number of notions. And the first question is, what problem do we have to solve? Second, isn't there already law which solves the problem or which addresses the problem in such a way that with a modern interpretation of this law, the problem can actually be solved? And only if the answer to this question is no, then the next question is, well, do we actually need new law? And what is it going to look like? So today's environment on robotics is already regulated in a large part by the machine directive, and also by rules such as the data protection regulation, which completely apply whenever a robot works with a human colleague, and learns about the human and collects data and processes this data. The regulation already applies. So we have to identify the specific issues which would require new law if we are coming forward with new proposals.
And finally, Paul, a general question now. What does the future look like for you in terms of robotics in the EU? And in what way can we really distinguish ourselves from other global players in this industry?
Well, I would say the robotics future in Europe is quite bright. First, in terms of the state of robotization today, it's the percentage in certain sectors of production with robots in Europe is very high. We have very good producers of robots and robotic technology in Europe. And as I said initially, combining these traditional lead skills of Europe with the new technologies of digital and AI, where at least in the industrial sectors, I would say, we don't have to walk with our heads held low. I think, there we also have much to show. I think the industrial potential for being competitive on a global basis is certainly there. And this paired with the ability of European companies to build complex systems, I think makes the outlook for robotics in Europe particularly good.
And a big thank you to Paul Nemitz there for taking the time this week to speak to us on our podcast. And that's about all we've got time for this time around. Please remember that online with us you can get a comprehensive breakdown of all the tech stories in the EU politics and policy domain with my free digital brief newsletter. Sign up online today, and don't forget to also subscribe to this podcast, which is published on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music. I've been Samuel Stolton, and thank you for listening.